Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sez the Vet. Don't forget to subscribe to catch the weekly episodes, thumbs up to let me know you're appreciating them, and comment away if you have any questions or requests. I'll see you in a sec. Okay, so we're talking about shelter for your farm animals today, and I'm going to focus on sheep. Now that winter is rolling around here in New Zealand, I'm sure I am not alone when I say that when I lie in bed at night listening to a storm brewing or heavy rain on the roof, all I'm thinking about is the number of grazing animals out there suffering with no way of finding shelter for themselves. We're going to go over your legal obligations, when and how they use shelter, how it differs at different life stages, and touch on their natural behaviour as well. I like my opinions to be evidence-based, so you'll hear statistics and facts dropped along the way. You'll see awesome pics of examples that you can put up easily in your own paddocks. Okay, let's jump in. So the Welfare Code states that every person caring for an animal has a fundamental obligation to ensure that animal has access to good shelter so it can protect itself. So every farm is going to be different. It depends what your environment's like. A block in Northland, New Zealand, for example, is going to be very different to one at the bottom of the South Island. But shelter is not just about the wind and the rain. Our grazing animals, including sheep, suffer with heat stress as well. So as our global climate becomes much more unpredictable, I would highly recommend providing good shelter regardless of where you are, so you don't miss the mark when that weird weather event happens. Another consideration if you live in the north of the North Island and think that your sheep just don't need it because we've got a tropical climate, is that they are prone to facial eczema up here, which makes their skin very sensitive to UV damage and sunburn, so they do have to have access to good shade. Now, our outdoor animals have a range of physiological and behavioural responses to try and keep their body temperatures from dropping too low or going too high. But just because something survives does not mean it's not suffering. If you work in the production sector for meat or fibre, be aware as well that even if they survive, a lack of shelter can mean poor production and poorer reproduction over the life of that animal. So that's a consideration. Now, of course, with older animals or underweight animals, or of course your young animals, lambs, they need even more protective shelter. They are at much higher risk of stress and death. They just cannot regulate their own body temperatures. So, minimum standards, these are the legal requirements. All sheep and beef cattle must have access to shelter to reduce the risk to their health and welfare. Sheep and beef cattle giving birth must be provided with an environment that protects the baby. Sheep and beef cattle must be provided with a way to protect themselves from heat stress. And when an animal is affected by the heat or by the cold, they have to be given priority and they have to be treated immediately to help them out there. Now, our code for best practice says that if you're bringing them in for yarding or transport at all, don't do this in the heat of the day. Okay, this leads to heat stress and diseases spreading like pneumonia. They should be able to get out of the mud and the flooded ground at all times. You cannot have them standing in the water or mud. And also take extra care when you're moving your littlies out of the rearing houses. You need to be watching the weather forecasts at this time and putting them back in the shelter if they need it. On that note, you should always be monitoring the weather forecast. Get everyone somewhere that's well sheltered. If there's heavy rain or a storm coming, you need to have a contingency plan, somewhere they can get to high ground if the place floods. But for you lifestylers and homesteaders out there, we're often talking about quite a small piece of land. So for you guys, just aim to have good shelter in each paddock. So here's probably the part you're all here for. What are your options for shelter? What are your easy go-tos? Your options include vegetation, so natural shelter, things like scrub and trees, shelter belts. Beware of trees that drop their leaves. There are many a well-intentioned owner that has planted a beautiful shelter belt only to find those trees bare and skeletal during winter at the time when the shelter's most needed. They're providing nothing. A shelter belt also only protects from prevailing winds from one direction. So you may actually need to have multiple, you probably will need to have multiple to offer proper protection. Also just be aware of toxic trees there, do a quick Google. Using the lay of the land is another option for shelter. So rocks, gullies, sheep will naturally seek out these areas for shelter. The downside here, of course, is that it is going to be an incomplete shelter and sheep can get stuck. They can get into real trouble when getting in between rocks and holes in the ground. In snowstorms, they can actually become trapped underneath an overhang. So if you've had some snowdrop, always go out hunting for them. Okay, look for holes in the snow melted by their breath on the other side. Rake the snow away, check there's no one under there trapped. Now for complete shelter, especially if you have old or young animals or live in a harsh area, you can create artificial shelters. And to be honest, this is probably what I'd do, because then you know you've got all your bases covered. Windbreaks, shade cloth, and of course, complete proper housing. You can even buy kit set housing for your paddocks and just pop one in each paddock. Now, if you need some help deciding what type of shelter to provide, here are some statistics for you. Wet, cold, and windy conditions can increase the deaths of your lambs by up to 80%. We see huge outbreaks of hypothermia starvation in lambs that are born into adverse weather. Researchers told us that offering shelter from the wind can reduce death rates, but only by about 10%, 3 to 13% to be exact. So it's really not doing anywhere near enough. Furthermore, if it's also cold and wet, then any benefit you've got from dealing with the wind is now null and void when it comes to lambs. Does that make sense? So all I mean is, once cold temperatures are at play, especially with the rain there causing a wet coat, your winter shelter belts are just not going to be cutting the mustard. You will still get mass deaths in lambs. Dense tussock scattered throughout the paddocks would offer good shelter for your lambs. They'll hide in it, but it's still unlikely to protect from rain. But most people aren't going to do this anyway because they don't like to sacrifice so much of their pasture, you know. Having tussock taking up space in your paddock means you're going to have less food for the sheep. The best thing you can do is build your artificial shelters, which protect from wind on all sides, rain from above, but still give access to get out if they want to, so that animals can seek the sun. If you are going to put artificial shelters in, just make sure the sheep are used to these shelters. Don't wait until a week out from winter or lambing and then plunk them in the paddocks. They are suspicious animals by nature, so give them some time to get used to the shelter and investigate them. And make sure you've got multiple options if you've got a big lambing paddock, okay? A ewe in first stage labour is going to be quite particular about where she wants to lamb, so having just one option, she may not necessarily agree with you. Now this is quite a cool thought that a lot of people won't have thought of. Increase fibre in their diet if you're trying to keep them warm. So that's hay. Increase hay. Eating a high fibre diet increases fermentation inside the rumen, that giant stomach, which produces heat. So it's like underfloor heating, but from inside the animal's body itself, which is very cool. Again, sheep can be suspicious by nature, so it's always a good idea to get them used to eating hay from a young age. And finally, lamb coats. This may not be practical for large farms, it almost certainly won't, but for a lifestyler, especially if you live in an area where temperatures really drop, get out there and get some coats on those lambs. After mum's finished bonding, of course. You don't want to interrupt her just after birth while she's cleaning and bonding with that lamb, or you'll cause her to reject it. You certainly want to have some little lamb coats on hand anyway for any particularly small lambs or orphans, even if you can't get out there and do it for everyone. Okay guys, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed some of the cool pictures of ideas out there. Thanks so much for checking in. Let's get everyone protected, guys, heading into winter so we don't have to lie in bed at night worrying about them. Thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.